Silence had carried me through, and in that silence I had found not only justice, but healing. My name is Beatrice Holloway. I am 65 years old, a widow, and for most of my life I have been called many things: dutiful wife, silent partner, quiet mother, but never incompetent. Yet that morning, in a courtroom packed with strangers and cameras, I heard my only son spit that very word at me. My mother is incompetent. She is incapable of running a company, let alone the one my late father built. The business should be handed entirely to me. His words sliced through the air, colder than the marble pillars that surrounded us. I sat still, my hands folded in my lap, but my heart beat hard against my ribs. The son I had once cradled with warmth and hope now looked at me as if I were an obstacle to be crushed. Nathan stood tall, his voice sharp, every syllable aimed like an arrow at my dignity. Beside him, Melissa leaned forward with her perfect smile, her hand resting lightly on his arm as though she were the guiding force of his rage. I caught the glimmer in her eyes, satisfaction, not sympathy. My mother-in-law, Helen, sat close by, nodding along, her disdain for me radiating like an old wound she never allowed to heal. And then there was Cynthia Reyes, the lawyer Nathan had hired, striding across the courtroom floor like a predator circling her prey. I should have spoken, shouted, defended my years of work beside Arthur, my late husband, the man whose vision had built the company worth $100 million. But instead, I remembered his words, whispered to me long ago in the stillness of our bedroom. Keep one paper safe. It will speak louder than you ever can. So I did not argue. I let silence cloak me like armor. I reached slowly into my bag and touched the folded document Arthur had entrusted to me on a day I had not yet understood. When Nathan's lawyer finished her barrage of accusations, the judge turned to me. Judge Harrington's eyes were steady, but there was something expectant in them, as though he sensed I carried more than I revealed. My son leaned forward, confident he had won. Melissa's lips curved into a smile of triumph. Helen's chin lifted, convinced her grandson was moments from securing what she always believed belonged to his bloodline, not mine. I placed my palm flat against the worn leather of my handbag, then slid out the envelope. My fingers lingered on it for a heartbeat. Then, without a word, I pushed it gently across the polished wood table toward the judge. The room seemed to pause, the echo of that small motion louder than any protest could have been. He took the paper, unfolded it, and began to read. At first, his expression was neutral, the practiced calm of a man accustomed to conflicts of wealth and family. But as his eyes scanned the words, the color drained from his face. His lips pressed into a thin line. He read again, slower, each phrase tightening the air in the room. Then, abruptly, he raised his head, his gavel suspended in mid-air. "No one moves," Judge Harrington said, his voice cutting through the rising whispers. "Immediately close the doors." The bailiffs leapt into motion, their heavy steps striking the floor as they moved to secure the courtroom. The click of the doors locking echoed like thunder in my chest. Gasps rippled across the benches. Nathan's face went pale, the blood rushing from it as though someone had pulled the very foundation out from under him. Melissa's hand slipped from his arm, her confident smile faltering. Even Helen, usually so rigid, clutched her pearls with trembling fingers. I sat in silence, my breathing steady. The document now lay in the judge's hands, not mine, and for the first time in years, I felt Arthur's presence beside me. This was the moment he had prepared me for, the moment when silence would weigh heavier than 1,000 speeches. My son had called me incompetent, but his voice no longer filled the room. Instead, the power belonged to a single piece of paper and the truth it carried. And as I sat there, under the sterile light of the courtroom, I realized this story was no longer just about a company or money. It was about dignity, about how easily family ties could fray when greed poisoned them, and about how sometimes the quietest action could shake the walls of power. If you have ever been underestimated, if you have ever been told you were too weak, too old, or too silent to matter, then you will understand why I chose not to shout. You will understand why I let my paper speak for me. Stay with me through this story. I promise it is not just mine. It is a story about justice, betrayal, and the strength we discover in ourselves when no one expects us to stand tall. And if you wish to hear more stories of silent strength and quiet justice, I invite you to stay with me, to share your thoughts, and to join me in proving that it is never too late to rise. That morning in the courtroom, my battle began with silence, and silence had already turned the tide. I remember the wedding as if it had been stitched into my skin. The flowers were extravagant, roses in every shade of cream and blush, arranged in tall crystal vases that glittered beneath chandeliers. The music was loud, violins and a piano echoing off the marble of the reception hall. Yet despite all the grandeur, I felt like an outsider in a world I had once helped create. Nathan and Melissa moved through the crowd like royalty, their smiles perfect, their laughter rehearsed. People leaned in to touch their arms, to congratulate them as if they were already the rulers of something larger than marriage. When I entered the room, I expected at least a seat near my son, a place of honor for the mother of the groom. Instead, I was guided by an usher to a small table at the far edge of the hall, tucked away near a service door where waiters carried trays of champagne. The chairs were uneven, the tablecloth slightly askew, as though this spot had been an afterthought. I lowered myself into the chair, smoothed my dress, and told myself not to mind, but I could feel the sting of eyes turning toward me, some with pity, others with quiet curiosity. From across the room, I saw Helen sitting close to Nathan, radiant in her silver gown, her smile wide as she whispered to Melissa. My mother-in-law had always believed Nathan belonged more to her than to me, as if my role in his life had been only to carry him until she could mold him into her image. That day, she seemed triumphant, finally rid of the woman she had tolerated for Arthur's sake. I lifted a glass of water and tried to swallow the knot forming in my throat. That was when I caught it, the sharp slice of a whisper carried to me, because Melissa had leaned too close to Helen. Her voice was soft but cruelly certain. Soon the company will be ours. My fingers tightened around the glass until it trembled. I set it down carefully, praying no one noticed. The words cut deeper than the seating arrangement, deeper than the isolation. I had been called many things, but to hear my son's bride speak of Arthur's life's work as if it were a prize to be stolen chilled me to my bones. I wanted to stand, to cross the room, to demand an explanation, but my eyes shifted to Nathan. He was laughing with his groomsmen, his arm around Melissa's waist, his eyes sparkling with a kind of pride that looked borrowed. He didn't glance at me, didn't seek me out even once. I saw no hesitation in his posture, no defense of the mother who had raised him. In that moment, I knew Melissa's words had not been a careless slip. They were a glimpse of something carefully planned, a seed already planted in my son's mind. The rest of the evening passed in fragments, a toast raised by Arthur's old business partners, their glasses clinking high above the laughter. Nathan dancing with Melissa, her white dress sweeping the floor as if she owned not only the night, but the future. Helen clutching Nathan's arm, her eyes shining with victory, and me at my lonely table, smiling politely at strangers who barely remembered my name, while my heart sank further into silence. During dinner, a few old friends stopped by briefly, offering smiles tinged with awkwardness, their words practiced. "You must be so proud, Beatrice." Proud was the wrong word. I was watching the boy I had loved with all my being drift further into a tide I could not stop. Each compliment felt like sand slipping through my fingers. I nodded, thanked them, and let them walk away, back to the glittering circle where I no longer belonged. Later, as the music softened and the night drew on, I stepped outside for air. The garden lights cast long shadows on the gravel paths, and the scent of roses followed me. I leaned against the stone railing and closed my eyes. Arthur had not lived to see this wedding, but in that moment, I was grateful. He had built the company with sleepless nights and relentless work, and I could not imagine the pain he would feel if he had overheard the words that now echoed in my mind. Soon the company will be ours. I touched the small pendant around my neck, a gift from Arthur on our 25th anniversary. It steadied me. I told myself that silence was safer, that speaking out would only make me seem bitter. But deep down, I knew I had crossed into dangerous territory. Melissa was not simply a bride eager for a new life. She was already setting her sights on the empire Arthur had left behind, and Nathan, my son, was walking willingly into her shadow. When I returned to the hall, the music swelled again, and Nathan and Melissa cut the towering wedding cake. Applause filled the room. I clapped softly, my smile fixed, my heart aching. Across the dance floor, Melissa's eyes met mine. She tilted her head, her smile sweet and polished, but her gaze was sharp enough to slice through glass. It was not the look of a new daughter-in-law, it was the look of a woman staking a claim. That night, as I sat alone in my car before driving home, I replayed the whisper again and again. I could no longer pretend it had been nothing. It was a promise, a warning, and a prophecy all at once. And I knew, though I could not yet admit it aloud, that the battle for Arthur's legacy had already begun, not in a courtroom, but in a wedding hall filled with roses and applause. After the wedding, life seemed to move forward for everyone else except me. Nathan and Melissa traveled to Italy for their honeymoon, posting smiling pictures beneath old stone arches, her hand always glittering with the ring I had helped pay for. Helen called me only once, her voice brisk, to inform me that the family would manage fine without my interference. I listened, nodded though she couldn't see me, and placed the phone back on its cradle with a weight that felt heavier than my own body. Nights were the hardest. I would walk through the Holloway house, quiet now without Arthur's laughter, and let my hand trail across the mahogany banister he had polished so often. In our bedroom, his side of the bed remained untouched, the books he loved stacked neatly on the nightstand, the fountain pen he had carried everywhere resting on the dresser. I would sit there and speak to him in whispers. I told him about the wedding, about Melissa's words, about the way Nathan's eyes never sought mine that evening. Sometimes, I swore I could feel Arthur listening, the echo of his steady patience filling the air. Arthur had always called me his silent partner. When he built the company, I handled the smaller things, organizing accounts, reviewing staff reports, listening when he needed to speak late into the night. He would say, "You may not stand on the stage with me, B, but you are the reason I can." I never needed recognition. Watching him flourish was enough. He had vision. I provided balance. Together, we raised a family and a business. That was the story I carried like a medal no one else could see. But the weeks after the wedding carried shadows I could not ignore. One afternoon, as I sifted through the company's quarterly reports, something I had continued out of habit, I noticed a line item that made my chest tighten. A transfer of funds appeared under my authorization, signed with my name, yet the handwriting was not mine. At first, I thought it must be an error, perhaps a misfiled document. I reached for the drawer where Arthur had kept all the old contracts, and I began comparing. The signature was neat, deliberate, but wrong. My hand always curved slightly when I wrote the letter H in Holloway, a flourish Arthur used to tease me about. The mark on this paper was stiff, angular, exact in a way mine never was. I set the papers down, my fingers trembling. Forgery was not a word I had ever imagined connected to my family, but there it was, staring back at me from the black ink. My name had been stolen, placed on documents that moved thousands of dollars without my knowledge. My heart pounded as I imagined who could have done it. Nathan had access. Melissa, too, by virtue of her new position beside him. The thought of my son forging my name was unbearable, yet the evidence lay open on my desk. I poured myself a cup of tea, hoping the warmth would steady me. As I stirred, I remembered the way Arthur would lean over my shoulder when I balanced the accounts. He always said, "Details save us, B. People lie, but numbers don't." His voice guided me as I examined the files again. Numbers do not lie. My son, however, might. The days that followed blurred together. I searched through more documents, each revealing small signs, paperwork filed without my approval, signatures that bore the shape of my name but not the life in my hand. The betrayal grew roots, spreading deeper than I wanted to believe. The boy who once ran to me with scraped knees and daisy crowns was now a man willing to erase me on paper. I tried to confront him once, choosing a quiet afternoon when Melissa was away. I called him, asked if he could stop by for tea, the way he used to. He arrived, his suit pressed, his tie neat, his smile polite but distant. As we sat in the parlor, I asked gently, "Nathan, have you seen these documents?" They carry my name, but I never signed them. For a moment, something flickered in his eyes, a shadow of guilt, but then his expression hardened. He set the cup down carefully and said, "Mother, you're imagining things. Maybe you don't remember. You're not as young as you once were." His words stung more than the papers ever could. He leaned back, crossing his legs, his voice calm, almost rehearsed. "It would be better if you left the company affairs to me now. It's time you let go." I stared at him, my throat closing around words I could not speak. Let go. As if the decades beside Arthur had been nothing more than a placeholder, as if I were a relic, not a partner, not a mother, not a woman whose hands had carried him through illness and loss. Nathan stood, kissed my cheek mechanically, and left with the faint scent of cologne lingering behind. After he was gone, I sat in silence. I wanted to cry, but no tears came. Only a hollow ache settled deep inside me. Betrayal has a way of making even the air heavier, as though the walls themselves accuse you of not seeing it sooner. That night, I opened Arthur's study again. The papers lay in neat stacks, untouched since his passing. On the top shelf, inside a small wooden box, I found the envelope he had once pressed into my hand during a late evening when his health had already begun to fail. "Keep one paper safe," he had told me. At the time, I had not understood. I thought it was his way of clinging to order, of making sure I did not misplace some contract. But now, with my name forged and my role erased, I realized he had known. He had seen the ambition in Nathan's eyes, perhaps even the influence of Melissa, and he had prepared me for this day. I placed the envelope back into the box, my hand lingering on the wood. The seeds of betrayal had been sown long before I admitted it, and as much as I wanted to deny it, I knew those seeds had begun to bloom. The first headline struck me like a slap across the face. My photograph, taken from years earlier when Arthur and I had attended a company gala, appeared beside the words, "Widow too fragile to lead $100 million empire." I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the ink, my teacup cooling in my hand. By the second headline, the narrative had already grown sharper. Son seeks control after mother's incompetence. Soon, every newspaper, every evening program, every financial magazine was repeating the same chorus. I was too old, too weak, too incapable. The lawsuit followed quickly. Nathan had filed in court, supported by Melissa's polished charm and Cynthia Reyes' relentless arguments. I received the notice in the mail, thick with pages, filled with accusations that questioned my mental clarity and my ability to manage Arthur's legacy. Each sentence was designed to strip away not just my authority, but my very identity. It felt less like a legal petition and more like an erasure of who I had been for decades. I tried to step outside one morning, hoping to find some relief in the simple act of walking through the town square. Instead, I was met with stares that lingered too long, whispers that curled through the air like smoke. A woman I had once served alongside on the community board crossed to the other side of the street rather than greet me. Another, an old acquaintance from church, offered only a thin smile before turning away. Their silence hurt more than words. It was the silence of judgment, the kind that confirmed what the papers had printed. Melissa, of course, knew exactly how to play her role. She appeared on a morning talk show, her voice breaking. She spoke of her concern for Nathan, her worry that the stress of managing both a marriage and a failing company would overwhelm him if something wasn't done. "We love Beatrice," she said sweetly, her eyes shimmering with false sincerity. "But she has been through so much since Arthur's passing. We only want to protect the company and ensure his legacy survives." I watched her performance on the television in my living room, my hands gripping the armrest so tightly the fabric bunched under my nails. I wanted to scream at the screen to tell the world that I was not fragile, not broken, not incapable. But every time I opened my mouth, the weight of Arthur's advice pressed against me. Keep one paper safe. Let it speak for you when no one else will. So I remained silent, though inside I felt as if I were being buried alive beneath lies. Nathan avoided direct conversation with me during this time, letting Melissa and Cynthia speak on his behalf. The only words he offered came through official letters drafted by attorneys, cold and lifeless. Each one reminded me that he no longer saw me as his mother, but as an obstacle to be overcome. The distance between us grew wider, a canyon carved by greed and shame. At night, I could hear the phone ring less and less. Friends who once called weekly grew scarce. Invitations to dinners and luncheons disappeared. The world outside my windows shrank, leaving me alone with the echo of my own thoughts. The betrayal of my son was heavy enough, but the betrayal of community, the people who once celebrated Arthur's achievements, who once claimed to admire me, was crushing in its own way. The newspapers began publishing details from the lawsuit. They wrote about alleged lapses in my judgment, about decisions I supposedly could not remember making. One article suggested I might be suffering from cognitive decline. I traced the words with my finger, disbelief turning to sorrow. These were lies, deliberate and cruel, planted to weaken me in the eyes of the court and the public. I thought of Arthur, how he had trusted in numbers and documents more than words. Perhaps he had foreseen that someday words would be twisted like weapons against me. One afternoon, I turned on the television only to see Melissa again, this time with tears sliding down her cheeks as she spoke about her dream to honor Arthur's memory. She clutched Nathan's hand as cameras flashed, and Helen sat in the audience, her face a portrait of righteous support. I knew, without doubt, that Melissa was orchestrating everything: the lawsuit, the press, the narrative that painted me as an obstacle to be removed. I sat alone in my living room after the program ended, the silence pressing heavy. The betrayal was public now, no longer confined to whispers at weddings or forged signatures in files. My humiliation was a spectacle, played out on screens and in headlines for all to consume. Yet even as the walls closed in, even as shame threatened to drown me, I remembered the envelope tucked safely in Arthur's study. I had not yet opened it. I did not know the full extent of what he had left me, but I knew enough to understand that silence, though painful, was still my weapon. So I endured. I let them call me incompetent, let them parade their accusations across television screens and glossy pages. I withdrew into myself, clinging to the faint hope that the paper Arthur had entrusted to me would one day reverse the tide. And though loneliness settled over me like an unwelcome guest, Somewhere in the hollow of my chest, a small ember remained. It whispered that the truth was not gone, merely waiting for its moment to be heard. The house had grown so quiet that I could hear the clock ticking in the hallway, each second a reminder of how little time I had left to restore what was slipping away. I wandered into Arthur's study one evening, drawn not by reason but by memory. His presence still lingered there, the scent of his cologne clinging faintly to the leather chair, the dust gathering slowly on the shelves where he had once pulled down ledgers with steady hands. I traced the edge of his desk, feeling the grooves he had carved with years of use, and whispered his name as though he might answer. I opened the top drawer and saw the wooden box he had left me, the same one I had returned to before. Inside was the envelope he had pressed into my palm during his final months, the one he had guarded so carefully. His words came back in a whisper, fragile but commanding. "Keep one paper safe. It will matter more than your voice ever can." For weeks I had resisted opening it, afraid of what I might find, afraid of what it would mean. That night, with the weight of humiliation pressing me down and the lawsuit turning my life into a spectacle, I placed the envelope on the desk and simply stared at it. Before I dared break the seal, I searched through the lower drawers where Arthur had kept his financial notes. Papers spilled across the desk, balance sheets, loan records, contracts. My fingers moved quickly now, driven by a restless energy that felt foreign after months of silence. And then I saw it. A bank statement showing large sums withdrawn in my name. My pulse quickened as I read the amounts, each one more staggering than the last. The destination was listed vaguely, transferred to accounts linked to a small offshore bank in the Cayman Islands. The discovery chilled me. My signature had been forged to authorize the withdrawals, but now the money was gone, funneled into places designed to stay hidden. I sat back in Arthur's chair, my hands gripping the armrests until my knuckles whitened. Nathan had accused me of incompetence, but the real incompetence belonged to those who believed the truth would never surface. They underestimated what silence could hold. I closed my eyes and thought of Arthur again. He had always known where danger lived, in greed, in shortcuts, in shadows. He had once told me that if the company ever faced corruption, the trail would reveal itself through the numbers. "Details save us, B," he used to say, his voice steady as he tapped a ledger with his pen. "The smallest misstep leaves the biggest mark." His faith in me, even then, had been stronger than my faith in myself. The following morning, I sought out Mr. Collins, the former legal advisor who had retired after Arthur's passing. He greeted me cautiously, aware of the headlines that had tarnished my name. We sat in his office, the blinds drawn, the air heavy with dust. I laid the forged documents and the bank statements before him. He adjusted his glasses and studied them for a long time before nodding slowly. "These are deliberate," he said. "Not sloppy mistakes, but careful deceptions." He hesitated, then added, "Arthur warned me once that Nathan might not resist temptation. He asked me to watch for irregularities." The words pierced me, yet they steadied me too. I was not imagining things. Arthur had seen what I was only now facing. I left Collins's office with a stack of advice and a confirmation that my silence had not been in vain. It was time to awaken, but to do so carefully, without alerting those who believed they had already buried me. That night I sat again at Arthur's desk, the envelope still untouched. I lit a small lamp and let its glow fall across the paper. My hands trembled as I considered opening it, but something within told me to wait. The right moment had not yet come. Instead, I placed the envelope beside the fountain pen Arthur had loved, its silver body catching the light. The pen and the paper belonged together, a pair waiting for their stage. I turned back to the financial records, combing through line after line, searching for threads that might unravel the larger scheme. The more I looked, the clearer it became. Melissa's name appeared indirectly, linked to new business filings that had surfaced in quiet corners of the records. One shell company, Horizon Wellness, had been incorporated under her maiden name, its accounts swelling with funds from suspicious transfers. I wrote the name in my notebook, underlining it 3 times. Horizon Wellness. The ember inside me began to glow brighter. I had been humiliated, painted as fragile and forgotten, but I was not powerless. The shame they had poured over me was only fuel for a quieter kind of strength. I thought again of Arthur's words, the faith he had placed in me. I began to realize that my silence was not weakness. It was strategy. Every insult, every false headline, every cold shoulder had been building toward a moment when the truth would no longer be deniable. As I closed the study for the night, I paused at the door and looked back. The envelope lay waiting, the pen beside it, the papers spread like a map of betrayal. But beneath the betrayal was also a path forward, one I would follow step by step until it led me to the place where silence would no longer need to be my shield, but my weapon. I climbed the stairs to my room with a steadiness I had not felt in months. The house was still quiet, the clock still ticking, but the sound no longer felt like a countdown. It felt like a measure, each tick carrying me closer to the moment Arthur had prepared me for. The days after my discovery felt like walking through fog, every sound muffled, every shadow holding a secret. I knew I needed more than suspicion. I needed proof. Arthur's warnings had always carried the weight of foresight, and now I could hear his voice urging me to follow the trail. So I returned to the records again, combing through the dense columns of numbers with a focus I hadn't summoned in years. That was when I found the first thread, a series of transactions tied to a company name I had never seen before, Horizon Wellness. At first glance, it looked legitimate, a health and lifestyle venture with a polished logo attached to its filings. But the addresses listed were vacant lots, places I recognized from the town map. I stared at the pages, my pen tapping the margin, until the truth became undeniable. Horizon Wellness was a shell, and the money flowing into it carried the fingerprints of those forged signatures I had already found. The realization left me shaken. My son's wife had created a phantom business, one designed to siphon funds away from Arthur's company while wearing the mask of innovation. I could almost hear Melissa's sweet voice on television, talking about protecting Arthur's legacy, while in the shadows she was bleeding it dry. Still, I needed confirmation. I scheduled a discreet meeting with Mr. Patel, the banker who had worked with Arthur for years. He welcomed me into his office with a professional courtesy that carried just a trace of pity. He had seen the headlines, too. I sat across from him at a long glass desk, my hands folded tightly together. "Mr. Patel," I began carefully, "I need to know about certain transactions. My name appears, but I did not authorize them. Can you tell me where they led?" He hesitated, his eyes flicking to the door as though to ensure we were alone. Then he lowered his voice. "Mrs. Holloway, I cannot disclose every detail without authorization, but I can tell you this. Large portions of shares in the company were used as collateral. The papers were signed under Nathan's authority." He paused, then added quietly, "The assets are at risk if obligations are not met." I felt the blood drain from my face. My son had not only allowed Melissa's company to thrive on stolen funds, but had also mortgaged pieces of Arthur's empire, the very foundation of his life's work. I gripped the edge of the chair to steady myself. "So the company could be lost entirely?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Patel's eyes softened with something like regret. "If certain deadlines are missed, yes. Whoever holds the debts will hold the future." I thanked him, though my voice shook, and left the bank with the weight of generations pressing on my shoulders. Outside, the sun was blinding, the streets busy with people who had no idea that one family's betrayal was unfolding quietly among them. I walked slowly to my car, every step heavy, every breath sharp with the knowledge of what Nathan had done. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with the papers spread before me. Horizon Wellness, mortgaged shares, forged signatures. It was no longer speculation, it was fact. My son and his wife had placed everything Arthur built into jeopardy, believing I was too weak, too silent to see. But I saw now, and once seen, it could not be unseen. The silence I had worn like armor began to shift inside me. It was no longer just protection, it was resolve. I could not storm into Nathan's home or confront Melissa with accusations she would deny. That would be reckless, and they would only twist it against me. No, my path had to be steady, deliberate, and precise. I thought again of Arthur, of the nights he stayed awake drawing up contracts, his eyes lit by the desk lamp, his pen moving with certainty. He never rushed. He never let emotion cloud his judgment. The strongest counterattack, he once told me, is built on patience. You let them underestimate you until the very moment they can't. I clung to those words, letting them guide me through the storm. When I finally went upstairs, the envelope in Arthur's study caught my eye again. I left it unopened, resisting the urge to lean on it too soon. I knew the time would come, but for now, gathering every thread of truth was my task. Each piece of evidence was a stone, and together they would form the wall I would stand behind when the storm broke. As I lay in bed, the weight of betrayal no longer crushed me in the same way. It fueled me. My son might call me incompetent, and Melissa might smile for cameras while emptying accounts, but I had begun to awaken. My silence was not surrender. It was the sound of something building, something inevitable. And though they could not hear it yet, I knew the reckoning had already begun. I knew I could not walk this path alone. My silence had carried me through humiliation, but now that the shape of Nathan and Melissa's betrayal had begun to emerge, I needed people who could steady me when the weight grew too heavy. My thoughts turned to Evelyn Price, a friend I had not seen in years. Evelyn had once been the sharpest accountant Arthur ever hired, a woman whose eyes could dissect a ledger as easily as others read a novel. Life had taken her in a different direction after retirement, but I knew if anyone could help me trace the shadows Melissa had left in the accounts, it was her. I called her one morning, my hand trembling as I dialed. When her voice answered, warm but cautious, I felt a surge of relief. "Evelyn, it's Beatrice. I need your help." There was a long pause, the sound of her breath over the line. Finally, she said, "Meet me at the cafe on Maple Street." Noon tomorrow. The next day, I walked into the little cafe, its windows fogged by steam, the scent of roasted beans curling through the air. Evelyn was already seated in a corner booth, her gray hair swept neatly back, her glasses perched low on her nose as she stirred her coffee. When she looked up, her eyes softened, though they carried the sharpness I remembered. "You look tired, Bea," she said gently. I slid into the seat across from her and unfolded the papers I had brought. For an hour, I told her everything: the wedding, the forged signatures, the lawsuit, the headlines, and finally, Horizon Wellness and the mortgaged shares. Evelyn listened without interruption, her pencil moving quickly across a notepad, her face grave. When I finished, she leaned back, tapping the eraser against the page. "This isn't just carelessness," she said firmly. "This is fraud, and it runs deeper than you realize." Melissa's fingerprints are all over it, but Nathan's choices make him complicit. They've tied themselves together, and if one falls, so will the other. Her words steadied me. For the first time since Arthur's death, I felt less like a woman drowning and more like someone beginning to swim. Evelyn reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "You're not alone in this. I'll help you be. We'll follow the money and we'll make the truth impossible to deny." With Evelyn by my side, I found the courage to reach out to another figure from the past, Daniel Rourke. He had been Arthur's closest friend, a lawyer with a mind sharp enough to slice through the thickest knot of legal jargon. After retiring, he had moved to the outskirts of town, living quietly in a modest home surrounded by pine trees. I drove out one chilly afternoon, the road winding like a ribbon through the hills. When he opened the door, he looked older, his hair white, his frame leaner than I remembered, but his eyes lit with recognition. "Beatrice," he said, his voice carrying both surprise and concern. I stepped inside, and as the fire crackled in his hearth, I told him the story that had consumed me. He listened in silence, his gaze fixed on me as though weighing every word. When I finished, he leaned forward, his hands clasped. "Arthur suspected this might happen," he said finally. My breath caught. He confided in me years ago, when Nathan first began showing signs of restlessness, when Melissa was only a name he mentioned with caution. He worried your son might not have the strength to resist her influence. Arthur drafted provisions, protections. He told me that if anything ever happened, you would be the one to stand against it. Tears pricked my eyes, but I held them back. To hear that Arthur had seen this future, that he had prepared me for it even in ways I had not known, gave me both sorrow and strength. "Do you still have what he left?" Daniel asked. I nodded slowly. "An envelope. He told me to keep one paper safe." Daniel's eyes sharpened with conviction. "Then that paper is the key. We'll need more evidence to frame the context, but when the time comes, it will silence every accusation against you. Until then, we build, we gather, we prepare." For the first time in months, I felt surrounded by something other than loneliness. Evelyn with her numbers, Daniel with his legal mind. They stood on either side of me like sentinels. My silence was no longer empty. It was fortified by their loyalty. As I drove home that evening, the fading sunlight painted the sky in strokes of amber and rose, and I thought of Arthur again. He had left me allies hidden in plain sight, waiting for me to call them back into my life. That night, as I sat at my desk, I wrote their names in my notebook, Evelyn and Daniel. Beside them, I scribbled Arthur's words once more, "Keep one paper safe." The embers of hope glowed brighter. My son might have stripped me of dignity in public, but in private I was gathering strength. The war he thought I could not fight had only just begun, and I was no longer facing it alone. The first sign that they knew I was digging came in an envelope slipped through my mail slot. It was unmarked, thin, and folded once across the middle. I carried it into the kitchen, set it on the counter, and forced myself to breathe before opening it. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 3 words scrawled in black ink. "Stand down now." No signature, no explanation, just the command. My hands trembled, but I read it again and again until the words blurred. I sat at the table staring at it, the clock ticking loudly, the silence around me suddenly thick with menace. I tucked the paper into a drawer, unwilling to let Nathan or Melissa know it had unsettled me. But that night, as I sat by the window, I noticed a dark sedan parked across the street, its headlights off, engine faintly humming. I watched it for nearly an hour before it finally pulled away, leaving behind the unmistakable knowledge that I was being watched. The following day, I confided in Evelyn and Daniel. Evelyn pressed her lips tight, her pencil tapping furiously against her notepad. "They're trying to scare you," she said. "That means they know you're closer to the truth than they want you to be." Daniel leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. "This isn't surprising. People who rely on deception will do anything to protect it, but you cannot give them the satisfaction of retreat." His calmness steadied me, yet I still felt the shiver of fear running through my spine. It was not long before Nathan appeared at my door. He didn't call ahead, just arrived one evening as the light faded, his silhouette framed by the last glow of dusk. When I opened the door, he smiled faintly, But it was not the smile of a son greeting his mother. It was the smile of a man who had rehearsed every word he was about to say. "May I come in?" he asked. His tone was smooth, polite, but his eyes held something sharp. I stepped aside and let him enter. He wandered the living room as if he owned it, his gaze lingering on Arthur's photographs, the bookshelves, the mantel. Finally, he turned to me and said, "Mother, all of this stress isn't good for you. Why put yourself through it? The company doesn't need you anymore. Let me handle it. You can live quietly. No one would blame you for wanting peace at your age." I folded my arms, my back straight. "You've already taken enough from me, Nathan. Don't stand here and pretend you're doing me a kindness." His smile faltered, replaced by a tightness around his mouth. "You think you're strong enough to fight this? You're not. The world already believes you're incapable. Do you really want it to get uglier?" For a moment, I saw a flicker of the boy he had once been, the boy who used to beg me to stay by his bedside during storms. But that softness was gone, buried under ambition and Melissa's careful manipulation. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "End this before it destroys you." Then he walked to the door without waiting for my reply. His cologne lingered long after he had gone, sharp and suffocating. That night, sleep would not come. I kept hearing his words, feeling the weight of the threat beneath his calm tone. Yet something else stirred in me too. Fear, yes, but also defiance. He believed he could frighten me into silence, but he didn't understand that silence was no longer his weapon. It was mine. The following week, the intimidation grew bolder. The same sedan followed me when I drove to the market, keeping several cars back but never out of sight. Once, when I returned home, I found the garden gate unlatched, though I knew I had closed it. Another time, a stone clattered against my window at midnight, startling me awake. Each incident chipped away at my sense of safety, but they also confirmed what Evelyn had said. They were afraid. People do not waste energy intimidating someone who poses no threat. I began carrying Arthur's fountain pen in my handbag, a small token of steadiness. When I gripped it, I remembered his faith in me, the countless times he had said, "You're stronger than you believe." I needed that reminder now more than ever. One afternoon, Evelyn and I sat surrounded by stacks of documents, tracing the flow of money through shell accounts. She glanced at me over her glasses. "They'll keep pressing until they think you'll break. But you won't, will you?" I shook my head slowly. "No, I've already been broken by their betrayal. Now I'm learning how to rise from it." Later that evening, Daniel called. His voice was calm but deliberate. "Beatrice, intimidation is a common tactic. They'll try to shake you, to rattle your foundation. But the law is not blind. When the time comes, the paper Arthur left you will outweigh every threat they've made. Until then, gather your strength." As I hung up the phone, I walked to the window and looked out at the dark street. Sure enough, the sedan was there again, waiting. I let the curtain fall back into place, my heart steady. They wanted me to be afraid, but all they managed was to remind me of what was at stake. The company, Arthur's legacy, my own dignity. It was worth enduring every shadow, every whisper, every stone in the night. By the time I went to bed, the fear that had clung to me like a second skin began to loosen. In its place grew something else, something that had been dormant for too long. Determination. They could send letters, watch from cars, throw stones, even use my son as their messenger, but they could not erase the truth, and they could not silence me forever. The deeper I went into the records, the more I felt as though I were wandering a maze built to confuse and exhaust me. Horizon Wellness was only the beginning. With Evelyn's help, I uncovered a chain of transactions that leapt across borders, flowing from one shell company to another, weaving through banks in Switzerland, Singapore, and the Cayman Islands. Each account had been designed to bury the truth under layers of complexity. But Evelyn's pencil scratched tirelessly across her notepad, her calculations neat and precise. "They're laundering the money," she murmured one afternoon, her brows knit in concentration. "Every transfer is designed to look legitimate, but the pattern is too perfect. Someone went to great lengths to disguise this." I stared at the spreadsheet spread across my dining table, feeling both overwhelmed and sharpened by what we were uncovering. The betrayal was vast, almost elegant in its design, and that realization burned like fire in my chest. This was not a careless mistake. It was a deliberate labyrinth, built to protect Nathan and Melissa's scheme until no one dared to question it. As the evidence mounted, I thought often of Arthur. His absence pressed against me in these moments more than ever. I could almost hear his voice guiding me through the maze, reminding me to look for the detail others would miss. He had always believed in leaving no stone unturned. One evening, I sat alone in his study, running my fingers across the spines of his old law books when I stumbled upon a file tucked between two volumes. It was thin, almost hidden, but inside lay a single clause, highlighted in Arthur's careful handwriting. At the top of the page, in his steady script, were the words, "Clause 17." I read the provision once, then again, the meaning sinking into me like a revelation. Clause 17 gave me, as his surviving spouse, full authority to assume control of the company if fraud or misconduct were proven within the leadership. It was airtight, witnessed, and signed in ink that carried Arthur's unmistakable hand. My breath caught in my throat. He had not only suspected this could happen, he had left me the very weapon to fight it. The discovery steadied me, but it also deepened the ache inside. Why had Arthur not told me sooner? Had he wanted to protect me from worry? Or had he feared that speaking the possibility aloud would make it real? I pressed the page against my chest and whispered his name, grateful and wounded all at once. He had trusted me with his legacy in silence, believing I would find the strength when I needed it most. The next day, I showed Clause 17 to Evelyn and Daniel. They exchanged a long look, their expressions grave but hopeful. "This changes everything," Daniel said, his voice low. "If we can prove the fraud, this clause gives you undeniable authority. Nathan can claim what he wants. Melissa can manipulate the press, but the law will favor you." Evelyn tapped her pencil on the margin of her notes. "We'll need more evidence to connect the shell companies directly to them." "But this is the foundation we've been waiting for." Hearing their words filled me with a steadiness I hadn't felt in months. For so long, I'd been drowning in humiliation and fear. Now, with Clause 17 in my hands, I felt as if Arthur had reached back through time to remind me that he believed in me more than anyone else ever had. But the path forward was not simple. The labyrinth of accounts stretched wider than I had imagined, and each discovery led to another dead end. Some nights, I sat at the table with Evelyn until the early hours, my eyes burning from the numbers, my body aching from fatigue. Other nights, I sat with Daniel as he combed through contracts, his finger tracing each line as he explained the legal ramifications. Their dedication reminded me that I was no longer alone, but the weight of the fight still pressed on my shoulders. In quieter moments, I thought about Nathan. I tried to imagine what had pushed him so far from me, what had twisted his ambition into greed. Had Melissa's voice drowned out mine so completely? Or had he always carried a hunger I had refused to see? I remembered the little boy who once left daisies on my nightstand, the teenager who promised he would make his father proud. Those memories clashed violently with the man forging my name and mortgaging the company. The labyrinth was not only financial, it was emotional, a tangle of love and betrayal I could not yet unravel. Still, each discovery brought me closer to the center. Clause 17 was my compass, Arthur's final gift. The shell companies were threads waiting to be tied together. The intimidation only confirmed that Nathan and Melissa feared what I might find, and through it all, the silence I had once hated now became my strength. I would not shout my discoveries into the world too soon. I would gather them quietly, piece by piece, until the day came when silence would thunder louder than any denial. That night, as I placed Clause 17 back into its folder, I paused and looked out the window. The street outside was still, the shadows calm for once. I pressed my hand against the glass and whispered into the darkness, "Arthur, I found it. I found what you left for me." For the first time in months, I felt not just grief, but purpose. The labyrinth was vast, but I was no longer afraid. The envelope had sat unopened for so long that I had begun to imagine it as something almost sacred, a relic of Arthur's foresight. But on that evening, as the storm rattled the windows and the house seemed to breathe with the weight of memory, I knew I could no longer delay. I carried the wooden box to the table, lit a lamp, and laid the envelope before me. My hands trembled as I broke the seal, the sound sharp in the stillness. Inside were several sheets of paper, folded with Arthur's precise care. The first was typed, stamped with the company's letterhead, and signed in bold ink. It was a notarized copy of Clause 17, the very provision I had discovered in his files. But this one was different. At the bottom, beneath Arthur's unmistakable signature, was a second witness signature, Daniel Rourke. My breath caught as I traced the ink. Arthur had not only written the clause, he had ensured it was certified and shielded from dispute. Beneath the clause lay another sheet, a handwritten note in Arthur's steady script. "B, if you are reading this, it means what I feared has come to pass. Do not let them convince you that you are powerless. I have left you the authority you need. The company was built by both of us, even if the world never saw it. When the time comes, use this, and remember that silence is not weakness. It is strength waiting for its moment." Tears blurred the words as I read them aloud, my voice breaking. For months I had endured humiliation and doubt, clinging only to fragments of memory and faith. Now, here was Arthur's voice reaching across time, reminding me of who I was. He had trusted me with his legacy, trusted me to wield the truth when the lies became unbearable. I pressed the note to my chest, letting the warmth of his faith steady me. As I dug deeper into the envelope, I found one final item, a slip of vellum folded carefully around Arthur's fountain pen. The pen gleamed beneath the lamplight, its silver body worn smooth from years of use. I remembered how he used to sign contracts with deliberate care, pausing before each flourish, as though to remind himself of the weight of every promise. Holding it now, I felt his presence stronger than ever, as if his hand rested over mine. I sat there for a long while, surrounded by the proof of his trust. The clause, the witness signature, the note, and the pen. They were more than documents. They were a testament to our partnership, proof that Arthur had never seen me as invisible. No matter what Nathan or Melissa claimed, he had known I would face this, and he had given me the tools to endure. The memory of the wedding came flooding back, sharper now. I remembered Arthur pressing the envelope into my hand that night, slipping it quietly into my purse as the music played and guests toasted our son's new life. He had been pale then, his illness already taking more from him than he admitted. I had scolded him gently for worrying about business on such a night, but he had only smiled and said, "One day, you'll understand." Now I did. I thought of Melissa's whisper at that same wedding, the words that had haunted me ever since. "Soon the company will be ours." How smug she had looked, certain of her power, convinced that I was too blind, too timid to see. I almost laughed through my tears. She had no idea that Arthur had chosen that very night to arm me with the proof that would undo her. The storm outside grew louder, rain striking the windows in steady rhythm. I gathered the papers carefully and placed them back in the envelope, sliding the fountain pen into my handbag. I felt lighter, not because the burden had vanished, but because I no longer carried it alone. Arthur was with me, Evelyn and Daniel were with me, and the truth itself was with me. The next morning, I met Evelyn and Daniel at my dining table. Their eyes widened as I laid out the papers, their fingers brushing the ink as if it carried a sacred weight. Evelyn adjusted her glasses, scanning each line. "This is irrefutable," she whispered. Daniel leaned back, his face solemn but proud. "Arthur prepared you better than anyone knew. This will end their claims. But timing is everything. We hold this until the court is ready. Then we release it, and the foundation beneath Nathan and Melissa will crumble." I nodded, my hand steady now. For months, I had felt like a woman trapped in the shadows of her own life, erased by her son's ambition and her daughter-in-law's cunning. But as I looked at those papers, I felt reborn. The silence that had once seemed like defeat had become a reservoir of power. I could wait. I could endure. And when the moment came, I would let Arthur's pen and paper speak the truth no one could deny. That night, as I prepared for bed, I placed the envelope and pen on my nightstand. I wanted them near, a reminder that I was not defenseless. I whispered Arthur's name once more, thanking him for believing in me when no one else did. The house felt different as I turned out the light, less like a tomb of memories, more like a fortress quietly gathering strength. I closed my eyes with a calm I hadn't felt in months. The battle was far from over, but the tide had shifted. They thought they had broken me. But Arthur's gift had awakened something I had forgotten: resolve. And now I was ready. I had spent weeks preparing myself for the moment I knew would come, the moment when I would finally stand face to face with Nathan and Melissa, not in a courtroom filled with strangers, but in the quiet brutality of family. The papers Arthur had left me burned like a secret flame in my handbag, and Clause 17 had given me strength to endure the storm. But none of that shielded me from the ache of what I was about to do. I invited them to the house on a Sunday afternoon. I kept my voice calm on the phone, almost maternal, as though I were only asking my son and his wife to share tea. Melissa agreed before Nathan could speak, her tone bright, falsely warm. "Of course, Mother, we'll come." I could almost hear her smile through the line. When they arrived, Nathan stepped inside first, his suit pressed, his expression unreadable. Melissa followed, her heels clicking across the floor, her perfume drifting into the room like smoke. She wore a cream-colored dress that looked delicate but was chosen with precision, her armor disguised as elegance. Her eyes swept over the room, assessing every detail before landing on me with a smile sharp enough to cut glass. I poured the tea myself, setting the cups before them as though we were simply family. We sat around the table where Arthur had once read the morning paper. Nathan cleared his throat. "Mother, I hope this means you've reconsidered. The lawsuit doesn't have to go any further if you'll just acknowledge the truth." "The truth?" I asked quietly. My voice carried no tremor. "Tell me, Nathan, whose truth are we acknowledging? Yours or Melissa's?" Melissa's smile never wavered, but her eyes hardened. "Beatrice, you've been under a great deal of strain. No one blames you, but you can't hold on to things forever. Arthur's legacy belongs with Nathan now. That's what your husband would have wanted." I felt my pulse steady as I reached for Arthur's pen, running my fingers over its cool surface. "Arthur wanted the company to survive," I said. "He wanted honesty, integrity, and strength. I do not see any of those things at this table." Nathan's jaw tightened. He leaned forward, his voice rising. "You're clinging to illusions." "Everyone sees it, Mother. The world knows you're not capable of running this company. You're humiliating yourself." I looked at him then, really looked at him, the man he had become, his face hardened with resentment, his voice carrying Melissa's cadence. My heart ached for the boy I remembered, but that boy was gone. "Nathan," I said softly, When did you start believing that erasing me would make you stronger?" For the first time, his eyes flickered with something uncertain. But before he could answer, Melissa leaned in, her tone sharper now. "Enough of this. We don't need to justify ourselves. You've had your time, Beatrice, and it's over. Nathan is the rightful heir. If you resist, you'll only bring more shame to yourself." Her words carried no sweetness now. The mask had slipped, and I could see her clearly at last, the architect behind every headline, every forged signature, every whispered accusation. She had manipulated Nathan into believing he was the victim, the hero saving his father's company from a fragile mother. In truth, she had been pulling the strings all along. I placed my cup gently on the saucer, the sound ringing in the stillness. "I know about Horizon Wellness," I said. Melissa's smile faltered. "I know about the mortgaged shares, the offshore accounts, and the lies you've woven into every corner of this family. Do not pretend this is about protecting Arthur's legacy. This is about greed." Nathan's face drained of color, but Melissa recovered quickly, leaning back in her chair. "Accusations won't save you. Who would believe you? You're a grieving widow grasping at shadows." I opened my handbag and laid the envelope on the table. I did not open it, not yet. I only let its presence fill the room. "Arthur believed me," I said. "He trusted me with this long before either of you imagined your schemes. And when the time comes, the law will believe me too." For the first time, Melissa's composure cracked. Her hand twitched against the tablecloth, her eyes narrowing. Nathan glanced at her, confusion flickering in his gaze. "Melissa?" he asked, his voice uncertain. She shot him a look so sharp it silenced him. But silence could not erase what had already been revealed. Nathan shifted in his chair, his confidence slipping. You don't know what you're talking about," he stammered. I leaned forward, my voice calm, almost gentle. "I know more than you think, and I know that one day soon, the truth will be heard in a place where your arrogance cannot drown it." The room grew heavy with the weight of what had passed between us. For a long moment, none of us spoke. Finally, Melissa stood, her heels clicking like hammers against the floor. "We're done here," she said, her voice low but venomous. "You can play your little games, but you won't win." She grabbed Nathan's arm, pulling him to his feet. He hesitated, his eyes lingering on me with something that almost looked like regret. Almost. As they left, the door closing sharply behind them, I sat alone at the table, my hands resting on the envelope. My heart was heavy, but I no longer felt powerless. I had looked them in the eye and named the truth. Melissa was the mastermind. Nathan was her willing accomplice, and together they had underestimated me. I lifted Arthur's pen and placed it beside the envelope, the two lying together like old soldiers waiting for their moment to march. For the first time, I felt ready. The silence I carried was no longer a burden. It was a blade, waiting for the day when it would finally cut through the lies. The courthouse smelled faintly of polished wood and paper, a mixture of authority and dust that settled into my lungs as I walked through the heavy doors. The echo of my heels followed me down the marble corridor, and for a moment I felt as though I were walking into a tomb. I held Arthur's fountain pen inside my handbag, its familiar weight grounding me. The envelope with Clause 17 remained sealed, waiting for the right moment. Today was only the beginning, and patience would be my weapon. When I entered the courtroom, Nathan was already seated at the plaintiff's table. He looked sharp in his tailored suit, his jaw set with determination. Melissa sat beside him, dressed in navy blue, her hair carefully styled to project sincerity. She leaned close to him, whispering something that made his lips curl into a small, confident smile. Across from them stood Cynthia Reyes, the lawyer they had chosen to spearhead their attack. She was younger than most in the room, but her reputation was well known, relentless, cunning, ruthless. I could feel her eyes on me as I made my way to my seat, her expression calculating. The room filled with quiet murmurs as people settled into the benches. Journalists lined the back rows, their notepads ready, their cameras tucked discreetly under jackets. Helen sat near Nathan, her silver hair glinting under the lights, her chin high as though she were presiding over the trial herself. I avoided her gaze, knowing it would only be filled with disdain. Instead, I focused on the bench where Judge Harrington would soon sit. The man who had already once read my paper and frozen the room with his command would now preside over the storm to come. The bailiff called the court to order, and we all rose as Judge Harrington entered, his black robe flowing behind him. He took his seat, his expression firm, and with a gavel strike the battle began. Cynthia rose immediately, her voice clear and sharp as she addressed the court. "Your Honor, this case is simple. We are here because a woman who has long been incapable of handling corporate affairs refuses to relinquish control of a company she neither built nor can manage. My client, Nathan Holloway, is the rightful heir to his father's legacy. He is capable, driven, and committed to ensuring the company survives. To leave the business in the hands of his mother is not only impractical, it is dangerous." She turned toward me, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Mrs. Holloway has shown patterns of confusion, financial mismanagement, and negligence. Her judgment is clouded by grief. We will present evidence that she is no longer fit to lead and that transferring full authority to Nathan is in the best interest of both the company and its employees." The words rang through the courtroom like hammer blows. My face remained calm, but inside my stomach churned. I knew their strategy. They would portray me as frail, broken, a relic of a bygone era. I folded my hands in my lap and forced myself to breathe. My silence was deliberate. Let them speak first. Nathan rose next, his voice carrying the tone of a man who believed himself justified. "My father built something extraordinary, but my mother never took part in its success. She was content to remain in the background, and now, in her grief, she clings to something she cannot handle. I ask the court to recognize that I am ready to carry on his vision. I loved my father, and I will not let his company falter because my mother refuses to see reason." His words struck me deeper than I expected. To hear him speak of me as though I had been absent, invisible, erased from the years of nights I sat beside Arthur, balancing accounts, listening, advising. It was almost unbearable, but I held my silence. I could feel Arthur's pen pressing against my handbag, reminding me that truth did not need to shout. Melissa dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, her performance flawless. "We only want what's best," she murmured, loud enough for the room to hear. Her tears glistened under the lights, carefully timed, perfectly staged. I saw the reporters scribbling, their pens moving swiftly to capture the image of the grieving daughter-in-law standing by her husband. Judge Harrington listened, his expression unchanged. When Cynthia concluded her opening arguments, he turned his gaze to me. "Mrs. Holloway," he said evenly, "you will have your opportunity to respond." I rose slowly, my knees stiff but steady. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. I did not reach for the envelope, not yet. That moment would come later, when the lies had tangled themselves tightly enough. For now, I only said, "I was there when my husband built this company. I know what it took from him and what it gave back. I will not let the truth be buried under accusations." My voice was calm, deliberate, each word chosen carefully. Then I sat down again, letting silence fall where they had filled the air with noise. Cynthia smirked faintly, as if convinced my restraint was weakness. Nathan leaned toward her, whispering something that made them both nod. Melissa's tears dried as quickly as they had appeared. They believed they were winning, that their words had swayed the court already. but I felt the steady beat of Arthur's presence inside me. This was only the beginning, and beginnings were meant to test patience. As the first witnesses were called, I watched carefully. Cynthia paraded former associates who claimed I had been distant from business decisions, painting me as an ornament in Arthur's life rather than a partner. Some of their words stung, but others revealed cracks, small details that Evelyn had already traced, contradictions that Daniel had warned me would surface. I noted each one silently, letting them build their case higher, knowing gravity would eventually bring it crashing down. By the end of the day, the reporters looked eager, sensing a story of triumph for the ambitious son and his grieving but incapable mother. But beneath their pens and whispers, I felt a steadiness growing inside me. They could not see the envelope tucked safely away, nor the fountain pen resting in my bag. They did not know that Arthur's foresight and my patience had already begun to shift the tide. As the gavel struck to adjourn, I lifted my eyes to Nathan. He looked triumphant, Melissa glowing beside him, but I saw the smallest flicker of doubt in his gaze, as if some part of him remembered the mother who had once held his hand through storms. That flicker would not save him, but it reminded me of the tragedy beneath the fight. I rose, adjusted my coat, and walked out with quiet dignity. The battle had only just begun, but the truth was already waiting for its moment. The courtroom was colder that morning, or perhaps it was only me who felt the chill. I walked in with the same steady steps, the same quiet composure I had carried through every humiliation, but inside my chest, my heart beat with a rhythm I could no longer silence. I had waited through their accusations, their witnesses, their polished lies. I had endured every headline, every whispered insult. Now the time Arthur had prepared me for had finally come. Nathan sat at the plaintiff's table, his suit immaculate, his smile controlled. Melissa leaned close to him, her hand on his arm, her voice a low murmur of encouragement. Cynthia shuffled her notes, radiating the confidence of someone who believed victory was already sealed. Helen sat nearby, her expression resolute, her eyes fixed on me with the cold judgment of someone who had wanted me erased since the day I married her son. When Judge Harrington called the session to order, the room fell into expectant silence. Cynthia began again, her words sharp as she reminded the court of my supposed failures. She painted me as fragile, confused, incapable of making sound decisions. I sat still, my eyes lowered, my hands resting lightly on my bag. Let them have their moment, I thought. Let them feel the triumph that precedes the fall. Finally, the judge turned to me. "Mrs. Holloway, do you have anything to present in your defense?" I rose slowly. My legs felt heavier than they ever had, but each step toward the bench carried me closer to Arthur. I opened my bag and withdrew the envelope, its edges worn from the many times I had held it, waiting for this moment. The courtroom shifted with quiet murmurs, the journalists leaning forward, pens poised. I placed the envelope on the table, then withdrew Arthur's fountain pen, its silver gleam catching the light. "This," I said softly, my voice carrying despite its calm, "is the truth my husband entrusted to me. He foresaw what might come, and he left me with the authority to protect his legacy." I handed the envelope to the bailiff, who brought it to Judge Harrington. The judge opened it, his face composed at first, his eyes scanning the document. Then his expression changed, his brows knit together, his lips pressed into a firm line. He read the clause again, slower, his shoulders stiffening with every word. Clause 17, Arthur's safeguard. His signature, clear and unmistakable. And below it, the witness signature of Daniel Rourke, undeniable proof of its authenticity. The silence in the courtroom deepened until even the faint hum of the lights seemed loud. Judge Harrington lifted his gaze, his voice steady but edged with authority. "No one moves." "Close the doors immediately." The bailiffs reacted at once, stepping to secure the exits. The sound of the heavy doors locking reverberated through the chamber, final and absolute. Gasps rippled across the benches. Journalists froze mid-scribble, their eyes wide. Nathan's face went white. His lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. Melissa's hand slipped from his arm, her composure faltering for the first time. Helen clutched her pearls with shaking fingers. Cynthia's confidence crumbled, her notes trembling in her hands. I stood silent, my eyes on Arthur's pen in my hand. It was as though his presence filled the room. His voice carried through the ink and paper that bore his signature. For months they had called me incompetent, too weak, too broken to matter. And yet, with one clause, Arthur had spoken louder than all their lies combined. Then, as the tension crackled through the chamber, a voice rose from the back of the room. Mr. Harris, the loyal employee who had stood by Arthur until the end, slowly stepped forward. His hair was white now, his posture bent with age, but his voice carried with strength. "I was there when Arthur drafted that clause," he said, his words echoing through the stunned silence. "He told me himself he wanted Beatrice to have the power to protect the company if ever dishonesty threatened it. He trusted her. He trusted no one else." Every head turned toward him. The reporters scribbled furiously, the clicking of pens like thunder in the stillness. Judge Harrington nodded solemnly, then looked back to Nathan. "These documents are binding." "This court will not ignore the clear intention of the founder." Nathan's voice finally broke free, desperate and trembling. "This is manipulation. She planted that paper. It's a lie." But even as he shouted, his words carried no weight. The seal, the signatures, the witness testimony, all of it stood against him like a wall he could not climb. Melissa's eyes darted, searching for a way out, her composure slipping into panic. "Nathan!" she hissed, but the damage was done. The gavel struck once, sharp and final. I closed my hand around Arthur's pen, the metal warm against my skin. My silence had carried me here, and in that silence the truth had finally spoken. The courtroom no longer belonged to Nathan or Melissa, nor to the lies they had woven. It belonged to Arthur's foresight, to my patience, and to the justice that had waited quietly for its moment. I lowered myself back into my seat, breathing slowly, my body heavy with relief. For the first time in months, I felt the weight lift from my shoulders. The reckoning had begun, and they could no longer deny it. The gavel had barely struck when the doors burst open. The heavy sound of boots echoed against the marble floors, and a team of federal agents swept into the courtroom with precision. Their dark uniforms and firm voices sliced through the chaos that had erupted after Judge Harrington's command. "No one leaves this room!" one of them barked, his hand raised. Papers scattered, journalists gasped, and the air thickened with panic. I sat still, my hands folded over Arthur's fountain pen, as if the world were finally moving in the direction it had always been destined to go. Nathan leapt from his chair, his face drained of color, but Melissa clutched his arm, pulling him back down with a hiss. For once, her composure faltered. Her eyes darted from the agents to the judge, to me, and then back again, searching for some hidden exit that did not exist. The lead agent approached Judge Harrington, who handed him the envelope with Clause 17. The agent flipped through it quickly, then nodded. "We have what we need," he said. He turned to Nathan and Melissa. "Nathan Holloway, Melissa Holloway, you are under investigation for fraud, forgery, and financial misconduct. Please stand." The words hung in the air like a bell toll. Nathan's body stiffened, his jaw working furiously as though he could grind his rage into silence. "This is absurd," he spat. "You can't do this. She's lying. She's been lying from the beginning." His voice cracked with desperation, not conviction. Melissa tried to rise, her hand raised as if she could charm her way through the authority of the law. "This is a mistake," she pleaded, her voice trembling. "We were only trying to protect the company. You don't understand." But the agents moved with efficiency, their hands firm as they pulled Nathan's arms behind his back, fastening the cuffs with a metallic snap. Melissa resisted for only a second before the weight of inevitability bore her down. The courtroom buzzed with whispers and gasps, pens scratching furiously as journalists captured every detail. Helen cried out from the bench, her voice breaking, "You can't take my grandson. He is the rightful heir." But her protests dissolved into sobs as the agents held their ground. I remained seated, my body heavy but my face calm. I watched Nathan struggle against the cuffs, his eyes wild, his breath coming fast. Then, for a moment, his gaze locked with mine. The courtroom noise faded, and it was only the two of us, the mother and the son, standing on opposite sides of a chasm too wide to cross. His eyes filled with something that startled me. Not rage, not even denial, but something closer to grief. As the agents tightened their grip, he whispered, just loud enough for me to hear, "I only wanted to be seen too, Mom." The words pierced me deeper than any accusation. For a heartbeat, I saw him again as the boy he had once been, the child who used to run into the fields and return with a fistful of daisies, grinning as he pressed them into my hands. "For you, Mom," he would say, his face beaming with pride. I remembered one spring morning in particular when he had climbed onto my lap, his hair smelling of grass and sunshine, whispering that he would always make me proud. The memory clashed violently with the man now standing before me, wrists bound, shoulders rigid with humiliation. My throat tightened, my hands trembling around Arthur's pen. I wanted to speak, to tell him he had always been seen, always been loved, even when blinded by Melissa's shadows. But the words caught in my chest. Love, too, had become part of the labyrinth, tangled beyond easy release. Melissa broke the silence with a desperate cry. It wasn't him. It was me. I made the connections. I arranged the accounts. Nathan only did what I told him to. Her confession rang out, raw and frantic, as the agents pulled her toward the doors. The journalists erupted, their pens scratching frantically. Nathan's head snapped toward her, his eyes widening in disbelief. For the first time, he looked at Melissa not as a partner, but as a betrayer. Judge Harrington struck his gavel, his voice steady through the storm. This court recognizes the authority of Clause 17. Control of the company is transferred immediately to Beatrice Holloway, as stipulated by the founder. Proceedings against the defendants will continue under federal jurisdiction. His words cut through the noise, final and indisputable. As Nathan and Melissa were led out, I sat in silence, the fountain pen heavy in my palm. Helen collapsed against the bench, her sobs echoing like the breaking of old glass. The reporters surged toward the exits, eager to spread the story that had unfolded like theater. And still I sat, breathing slowly, my heart torn between justice and sorrow. When the courtroom emptied, I remained behind, staring at the chair where Nathan had sat only minutes before. His words replayed in my mind. "I only wanted to be seen too, Mom." They echoed louder than the gavel, louder than Melissa's confession, louder even than the agent's commands. My son's betrayal had burned me, humiliated me, nearly destroyed me. And yet beneath it all, there was still that child who once held daisies in his small hand. I rose slowly, gathering the envelope and the pen. As I walked toward the doors, I whispered into the empty room, "You were always seen, Nathan. You just chose not to see me outside. The air was sharp and cold. The courthouse steps were lined with flashing cameras, reporters shouting questions, microphones shoved forward. I kept walking, ignoring the chaos, my silence stronger than any statement. I descended the steps, each movement heavy with both victory and heartbreak. The battle for Arthur's legacy had reached its turning point. Nathan and Melissa were in custody, the lies stripped away. Yet in the hollow of my chest, a mother's grief stirred alongside a widow's triumph. Justice had come, but it had not come without cost. The days after the trial unfolded like the slow turning of seasons. For months, I had lived beneath a storm of shame, betrayal, and fear. But now, the air felt different. It was lighter, though still tinged with sorrow. Reporters no longer camped outside my home, though their articles still appeared on the front pages, this time not condemning me, but marveling at the widow who had reclaimed her husband's legacy with a single paper and a pen. They called it poetic justice, a story of dignity restored. Yet I did not feel triumphant. What I felt was quiet. I returned to the company headquarters for the first time in months, walking through the glass doors with a calm I had not known in years. Employees turned their heads as I passed, their expressions uncertain, some ashamed. They had read the headlines too, and many had believed them. Still, no one spoke against me now. I climbed the steps to Arthur's old office, unlocked the door, and stood in the doorway, breathing in the scent of leather and paper that still lingered. The desk was as he had left it, polished and orderly, though dust had begun to settle in his absence. I sat in his chair and let the silence wash over me, not as loneliness this time, but as presence. Arthur was here, in the wood, in the walls, in the paper that had saved us both. In the weeks that followed, I made a decision. I would not simply hold the company for myself, nor would I let it remain a monument to a battle won. Instead, I established the Holloway Trust Foundation. Its purpose was simple: to use part of the company's wealth to support families who had been silenced, widows and children who had been left behind but still carried strength within them. I wanted others to know that silence could be power, that dignity could be reclaimed even when the world called you weak. Evelyn and Daniel stood beside me as I signed the foundation's charter. Evelyn's eyes shone with quiet pride, while Daniel nodded solemnly, his hand resting briefly on mine. "Arthur would be proud," he said. I believed him. I felt it in the air, as though Arthur's approval brushed my shoulder like the warmth of sunlight. One morning, as I sorted through the mail stacked on my desk, I found an envelope with no return address. Inside was a letter written in careful script. It came from a family of a veteran who had once worked for the company. They wrote of how Arthur had given their father a chance when no one else would, how that opportunity had lifted them out of hardship. They thanked me for carrying on his legacy with honor. Reading their words, I felt tears slip silently down my cheeks. I placed the letter beside Arthur's photograph and his pen on the mantelpiece in my living room. Together, they became a small shrine, not to loss, but to endurance. Helen never visited me after the trial. I heard whispers that she had withdrawn into seclusion, her pride shattered by Nathan's downfall. Part of me pitied her, though I could not forget her years of scorn. As for Nathan, I could not bring myself to visit him in custody. The image of him in handcuffs, whispering, "I only wanted to be seen too, Mom," haunted me at night. Sometimes I dreamed of the boy with daisies in his hands, and I woke with a heaviness in my chest. But I did not regret what had been done. Justice had demanded it, and Arthur's trust in me had required it. Love does not erase accountability. Melissa's name appeared in the newspapers too, her confession replayed endlessly. She had tried to shift blame onto Nathan, but the evidence proved her central role. The world finally saw her as I had long suspected: clever, ruthless, but undone by her own greed. I no longer hated her. Hate requires energy, and I had no more to give. What remained was a distant sorrow for what she had stolen, not just from me, but from Nathan too. Life grew quieter as spring turned to summer. The garden began to bloom again, daisies sprouting along the edges, as though reminding me of gentler days. I knelt among them one morning, letting the sun warm my face, and I whispered into the stillness that I forgave the boy my son once had been, even if I could not forgive the man he became. The daisies bent in the breeze, and for a moment, it felt like an answer. On the final evening of the Foundation's first month, I stood by the window of the company office. The city stretched out before me, bathed in the glow of dawn breaking on the horizon. In my hand, I held the letter from the veteran's family. I placed it gently beside Arthur's photograph, the fountain pen resting across the frame. The light of the rising sun touched them all, turning the silver pen into fire. I whispered softly, "Some battles are fought in silence, and sometimes silence is the loudest victory." The words hung in the air, not as bitterness, but as peace. I no longer needed to prove myself. I had endured humiliation, betrayal, and fear, and I had risen through all of it with dignity intact. As the first rays of sunlight spilled into the office, I stood tall, feeling not like a widow clinging to what was lost, but like a woman who had begun again.